Yeah, hey there. Chapter 12, Lesson 1. And what we're going to be taking a look at here in this chapter is going to be the American home front during World War II. And specifically today, what we're going to be taking a look at is the issues surrounding the economy and ethnic minorities in America. And we want to start by saying in this chapter, our essential question is what makes people give up so many things during war. In particular, as we look at this first slide, we're going to be taking a look at ethnic minorities having to serve a prejudiced country and whether or not that's something they want to do. Remember that World War II for America, anyway, is 1941 to 1945, and that's an America that's still segregated and very racist. We have the Ku Klux Klan in the South, we have lynchings going on across the country, we don't have a civil rights movement the way we'd seen, and we're only 20 years away from the Red Summer of 1919 and 1920 with large-scale race riots. So what we have to figure out here is whether or not Americans, particularly ethnic minorities, are going to want to serve and fight for America. Why would you, if you were in fact an American ethnic minority, want to fight for our country? What we're going to see is that ethnic minorities come up with really a rationale to fight that makes a lot of sense for them, and it's called the Double V campaign. Essentially, even though we're going to see ethnic minorities, for example, African Americans, organized into segregated units when they fight in World War II underneath white officers, they're going to say that, you know what, this is what's called the Double V campaign in World War II. Victory over Hitler's racism abroad and racism here at home. Here's the concept, and this comes from an African American soldier during World War II. The Army Jim Crows us. Employers and labor unions shut us out. Lynchings continue. We are disenfranchised. That means they're deprived the right to vote. And spat upon. What more could Hitler do to us than that? In other words, that there is no reason why this war can't serve as a real opportunity for ethnic minorities to prove themselves equal and in some ways superior, right? I mean, and that to show that you're just as good, if not better, than the dominant white population when it comes to being a person, being human. It gets so bad that even FDR has to order African Americans put into combat because white officers don't want to put them there. And what we're going to see is that as ethnic minorities embrace this double V, this victory over racism here at home, here's our chance to show white America that we are awesome. And over Hitler's racism abroad, what we'll see is some of the very best fighting units in America during World War II are staffed by segregated African American, Japanese American, and other ethnic minorities. I've given you a couple of examples here. One example that we can take a look at is going to be this group right here. This is the Tuskegee Airmen. And the Tuskegee Airmen were an African American fighter squadron that did tremendous work. In fact, when they were first assigned to the European theater in the in the early 1940s, the late part of World War II, their combat record was unproven, and whites did not want to fly with them because, you know, whites are and were at the time racist in many ways, shapes, and form. So here is just really quick some of their combat record that really shows you what I'm talking about. So we've got here, for example, 15,000 combat sorties, over 100 German planes destroyed, 150 German aircraft destroyed in the ground, a destroyer sunk, pilots killed in accident, in action, or otherwise, 32 other pilots downed, captured as prisoners of war, but not a single bomber ever lost, not a single one while it was being escorted, 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 744 Air Medals, 8 Purple Hearts, 14 Bronze Stars. In other words, this is one of the best fighter squadrons America has at its disposal, and it is African Americans fighting not just against Hitler, not just fighting for America, but they're fighting for each other to prove their equality as people. The same could be said for this group right here, 100th Infantry, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up of primarily Japanese Americans. That's a big deal because Americans, of course, were really upset with the Japanese. In fact, if you were going to be a Japanese American and you served in World War II, you had to serve within these groups because nobody else wanted to serve with you because Japan had attacked us by surprise. One half of the Japanese Americans that actually fought with these American Army units had been in something called an internment camp, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. It's essentially a concentration camp. We're going to see ethnic minorities really become essentially some of the most decorated, in the case of these two Japanese American units, the most decorated units in the United States military history. When you take a look at it, the successes of groups like the Tuskegee Airmen, these Japanese American groups, they were able to influence policy. They had a victory because several years after World War II ended, 1948, their successes could be used by our president, Truman, at the time, since FDR will die in 1945, to desegregate the military, to essentially fully integrate our military. That's a really, really, really big deal, to have a fully integrated military where no segregation exists. That's a huge victory over racism. So there are some sacrifices that we'll see Americans make. What about some others? I think an easy way to look at other sacrifices being made by Americans during this time is to broaden our scope a little bit, right? Let's not just talk about ethnic minorities, a small section of our population. Let's expand that. And let's take a look at Americans as a whole. And what we'll see is that Americans are going to have to change how our economy works, right? I mean, we're an economy that's in 1940, not one that's actually building and running for war. Instead, what we have is an economy that is actually functioning as one for regular, everyday society. And so what we want to do here is totally reconvert our economy into something that is going to essentially really become a war machine. So we'll take a look at a couple things here as we see Americans making sacrifices, giving up what their everyday economy looks like, and instead embracing a couple of different things, like something called the cost-plus economy, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and really seeing how that looks in terms of nuts and bolts with the kinds of things that we produce, no longer producing refrigerators and cars, but instead producing bombers and ships. So we'll see what that looks like here as we see these kind of old ideas and ways of living kind of given up, sacrificed, so that we can see women in the workforce. We can see the Depression finally coming to an end. We can see Americans kind of break these work barriers that kind of separate them in the workplace as white or black or Hispanic or woman or man. So let's delve into some of these details, because we know that our economy needs to convert itself into a war machine. And really, when it does this, you are going to see the American economy as a war machine really put an end to the Great Depression, which is a great thing. But how do we do that? And the answer is going to be something called the cost-plus system. And it's definitely going to speed up war production because it's going to encourage factories to make a lot of war products as quick as it can. Let me show you how that works. The government's going to come to your factory, let's say, and it's going to give you a contract, a cost-plus contract, and it's going to pay you to make something, whatever that war thing is. And let's say you're going to make tanks, right? And the government is going to buy the tanks that you make at a small profit. So here's one tank that you've made in your company, and it's going to give you a small profit. Well, why is that going to encourage me to keep making tanks if it's all I'm going to get is a small profit? That's not something I'm going to want to do, right? Well, let's zoom in and look at the details. That tank that you made Well, that tank is made up of all kinds of things, right? Like copper and steel and fuel and rubber. Not only is the government going to buy your tank for a small profit, it's also going to pay for your costs to produce that tank. So all of these things right here and all of these costs, the government's going to pay for them. In other words, you don't have costs. All you get is profit. So what would seem like a small profit actually becomes a big profit because you don't have any costs. This is something that many companies see as a huge advantage. So they're going to convert their war factory or their factories into war production. Hi guys, people visiting us here. Take a look, everybody. Look, see? Some visitors. Everyone say hi. Yeah. All right, so they're going to convert their factories into war production. And we're going to see that in terms of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, that old World War II Depression era organization that was trying to lend money to businesses, still doing that, but now saying, hey man, now make us those tanks, now make us those guns, those socks, those uniforms, whatever it is that our economy needs. Specific examples could come from the automotive industry, for instance, where the B-24 bomber is made by Henry Ford. He converts his factories into assembly lines for planes like this bomber here, the Liberator. Instead of making cars, now his assembly lines are efficient at making those kinds of planes. Boom. Mind blown. We're going to see Americans revolutionize the way they make their products, like when our ships, Liberty ships right here, when our ships are sunk by German submarines at a pace that we can't necessarily overcome. We're going to change that, for example, by building ships across the country in places like Oklahoma and Nebraska, where there's no water at all. And instead, what we'll see are individual factories making small components of a ship. So what we see maybe is this factory in Mississippi makes a part, and this factory over here in Alabama makes a part, in Oklahoma and Nebraska. And each factory ships it to the coast, where it's assembled in Norfolk, Virginia, for instance, and put into the water. This can take the amount of time it would handle us to build a ship from 244 days down to 41. We completely revolutionize the way our economy operates. We make it so much more efficient. Part of that process of increased efficiency is recognizing that as an economy, what we need is everyone working in our factories, including women, large numbers of women, known as Rosie the Riveters. These women who come to factories, like my grandma, Genevieve, they come to factories and they work on whatever it is that factory is making because the men have been drafted and are off fighting overseas in Europe or overseas in the Pacific. And these women work in the millions to help our war economy take off. You're going to see Rosie the River, this character from a song. She's going to become a symbol of this. And I'm sure you've seen it, these posters, we can do it, as women take up whatever tools are required to make war materials. And even racism, which would keep African Americans or Hispanics or Japanese Americans out of working in war factories, is overcome when FDR creates the Employment Practices Commission to end discrimination in defense contracts, in defense industries, so that we can get as many Americans as possible working in our war economy. As a result, war production takes off. And you can see it here. Up, 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 whether it's aircraft, whether it's ships, whether it's tanks, production goes up, up, up. Tomorrow in class, we'll talk about why, after this year, production seems to decline. I wonder why that is. Put that in your little nugget for later. Oh, and by the way, hey, do me a favor. When you come into class tomorrow, just put a little smiley face on a piece of paper and hand it to me. And don't tell anyone else that you got it from this video, because we want to be sure they're listening. And if you're one of the ones who has listened, I say thanks. Don't tell those people who haven't what's going on. Remember, smiley face in my hand so I can high five you. Oh, and put your name on it too, okay? Thanks. These sacrifices, while they do transform our economy into a incredible war machine, at the same time, it does change the way Americans have to live their lives. I mean, the wants and needs that Americans have are going to have to be sacrificed, and that's going to even include civil rights. We're going to set up internment camps, for example, to put Japanese Americans in. We're going to ration. We're going to force Americans to really fend for themselves in some ways for even food production. We're going to see Americans asked to give up their money to support the war effort by buying war bonds. All kinds of things are going to happen here as Americans have their wants and needs, but at the same time, they're not going to be able to meet them because those wants and needs have to be set aside for the greater war effort. I'll give you some specific examples. The government creates during the war something called the Office of Price Administration, and its goal was to ration. And every month, you would get, as a family, one of these ration booklets. And you can see this one belongs to Cecil Andrews. And Cecil Andrews would go to his local Office of Price Administration, wherever it was. There was one over in Hanover, for example. I'm sure there was one down in York. And you would get there these little booklets, and you'd open these little booklets up. Every month you'd get a couple of them. And inside the booklets would be these little stamps that you can see here just next to my head. And in these stamps you would see certain letters and number combinations, and they would be useful for different things, like maybe wheat or coffee or butter, goods that the soldiers were needing overseas in the Atlantic, in the East, or in the West, in the Pacific. We don't want Americans buying all the coffee, for example, or shoes or gasoline when we need it for the war effort. So every family was limited with the amount that they could buy via these ration stamps and in these booklets. Americans, of course, are going to want more than just those ration booklets can provide. So you're going to see Americans planting victory gardens, for example, as a way to compensate, to grow their own food that would otherwise be rationed. Now, I'm not talking about people building planting coffee trees in their backyards, but if people could grow more of their own food, that's less that they would then be taking off the market, which could be given over to soldiers, right? Do lift less so they'll have enough, right? That's the concept here. You're going to see Americans moving, even packing up where they live. We may want to live here in PA, but maybe the war factories are going to be found in places like the South, where there's more opportunity to build factories because you have a workforce that isn't already in them. Remember, the South and the Southwest are primarily agricultural, primarily rural. Already in the North and the Northeast, we have tons of factories. If we need to produce more, well, let's build factories where there aren't any, and we can get people there to work in them. That's the idea. So you're going to see Southern California, the Southwest, the South really expand during World War II. And it still is, as a matter of fact. It's an area called the Sun Belt. People are going to be moving from up here in the Northeast to the South and Southwest to take those jobs. That's the plan anyway. Other sacrifices are financial, like war bonds, where we buy over $150 billion worth of war bonds in order to lend the government that money. And even other sacrifices are going to come in the kinds of things that we see and hear about when we have groups like the Office of War Information trying to help us understand the war so we know what sacrifices have to be made, so that we are willing to make those sacrifices for our soldiers and for the war economy. One of the biggest sacrifices that Americans make, in part because of our war with Japan, is going to be our civil rights. FDR orders that any place in America could be declared a military zone if we might see invasion. As a result, if you look at a map, most of Western of America is going to be marked for invasion. Let's not forget the Japanese are there and the West, and even Eastern America could be marked for invasion from German. So what does that mean? As a result, when we mark an area down as a military zone, Americans are going to force Japanese Americans or Americans of Japanese descent into internment camps. That's a nice way of saying a concentration camp. It's really the same thing. It's just a gigantic camp that essentially is there to housed people of Japanese descent. You can see pictures of it down here, and they look just like those camps that you would see, in Germany, rows upon rows of military barracks where you just stuff people in. Some of the reports showed that, these barracks would be made for, 4 to 10 people. Instead, you've got 25 people crammed inside them. I mean, it was not a pretty situation by any means. These 10 different internment camps built across the nation are there because we fear, right, that Japanese Americans might be spies. Of course, we didn't lock up nearly as many German Americans, I guess probably because it's harder to figure out who's German American, who isn't, right? Because German Americans are of white ancestry, right? Where even if your last name is Smith, if you look Japanese, we could probably figure out you are, as opposed to your last name being Smith and being of German descent, and not quite sure about that unless you go around wearing lederhosen, right? So we see 110,000 American citizens deported to these internment camps. Here's a quote: "Climbing into a truck, we drive through buildings and bustling Chinatown. In a few minutes, we're there in the corner of 8th and Lane, usually deserted, but filled up now with silently labeled Japanese standing there just waiting with their suitcases and their sea bags." And this was a mess of a situation, folks. It really was, because what happens here to your life, right, when you receive, this order of evacuation. And that's what this image is here that I just put up, right? It tells you exactly what you have to do. Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in these areas. Here's where you have to go, when you have to go there, what's going to happen to you, and we're going to bus you off to one of these internment camps. And just think about it logically, right? So then what about my house? What about my job? What about my business? Well, as soon as the day after Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were posting big banners like this one. This is actually a photograph from Dorothea Lange on their stores that say, "I am an American. I'm not Japanese. I'm not a spy. I'm not a bad person." But the reality is, you can't hold on to this business when you are in an internment camp. So when you first saw that sign go up that said, "It's time to relocate," you had to figure out what to do with your business. You had weeks to sell everything inside your business, just weeks, and even to sell the business itself. That's incredible, because really, there's no way you're going to get what you're owed when you're closing out for an evacuation sale, because everything has to go, including the business. Now think about that on the flip side. When you get out of the internment camp in 1945, you don't have your business anymore. You don't have an inventory. You don't have a place to put it. And you probably didn't get enough money when you left to open up a new one when you get out, because you had to sell everything at a discount. It's a remarkably difficult situation to put people in when they go to these concentration camps, which are located in the middle of nowhere, by the way. Like this one here, for example, located out in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. No shelter, and it's freezing cold. When the winter came, there weren't even blankets. Good job, America. These conditions were not great. I mean, it's by nowhere concentration camps that you're going to see Stalin use or Hitler use, but this isn't exactly hotel living, folks. And these people are American citizens. They didn't do anything wrong. In fact, we didn't find anyone of Japanese descent, really, at all, that we could say was a spy. Not really. Not many at all that you could kind of chalk up there. Kind of reminds you of Americans' paranoia about Muslims, doesn't it, in the present day and age? Interesting. Japanese Americans, as you might think, wouldn't take this sitting down. They actually sue. And here's the interesting thing. The Supreme Court says in the lawsuit that was brought by Japanese civilians called Korematsu versus the United States, in the Supreme Court, when it goes there, it says, you know what? The government can suspend your rights. It's questionable if it does it on race, but it can if it needs to. Now, obviously, we realize that this is not a good situation, so it takes us only 40-something years for our president to apologize and to give $20,000 to each Japanese American survivor. So we'll talk more about this, as you might imagine, when we get into class, and we'll see you then.